Good afternoon, everybody. We were just letting some more people get into the queue. So thank you to everybody for joining today. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is David Carlson. I am U.S. Manufacturing and Automotive Industry Practice Leader for Marsh. We are pleased to have everybody join us today. We appreciate you taking the time for this very important topic, building for the future of electric vehicles and electrification, fire protection, and property insurance considerations and construction considerations as well. Next slide. Great. As I mentioned, we will have a panel discussion today, so we will not have a bunch of slides that we'll be showing. We really want to make this interactive. So quick reminder, please, everybody use the chat session and the Q&A in particular for any questions you may have as we go through today's conversation. We will save some time at the end for answering questions that show up in the Q&A. But again, try not to use the chat, use the Q&A lever if you could, a button if you could. As mentioned, our dialogue today, fireside chat, is two industry experts that I work very closely with in our automotive industry practice. First is John K. Johnson, Managing Director, Construction Practice Leader for the Central Zone for Marsh, and Greg Masterson, Senior Managing Consultant for Marsh Advisory Services. Next slide. So as we mentioned, what is the topic today? You cannot look at any type of social media or any type of industry alignment without seeing global sales of electric cars, where they're going, how millions of vehicles are being sold, more than have in history. And according to the International Energy Agency, automotive manufacturers are expected to go fully electric, and we've been seeing that across the board. Every major OEM has put a flag in the ground and said that they are absolutely dedicated to this topic and dedicated to meeting these needs. A lot of it is around ESG and net zero, but also just doing what's right for their organization and building sustainability and resilience in their organizations as well. Next slide. So as I mentioned, you open up emails every day, industry associations, social media, and these are the kind of headlines that we see every day. And I'm not going to read through those because these are topics that we see and they have made major headlines. But the reality is billions of dollars are being invested in building battery operations, battery manufacturing, recycling. Also, OEMs are putting billions of dollars into research into developing new models of vehicles, electrified hybrid crossover vehicles, you name it, you see it. There are so many new brands that are being brought out, and that just is a sign of the future of where automobiles, mobility, and overall just the industry is going. So when we looked at topics and we talked internally, we thought the most important probably place to go is construction, property considerations, and what's going on in that industry. And so we landed on this topic today. So we're really pleased to have our two panelists, and we're going to start our conversation here with John and with Greg. Great. So, John and Greg, glad to have you with me today. Let me start off with a conversation around kind of overall ideas and thoughts and some of your experience you've seen. John, in your opinion, what's the most critical element an owner should consider before embarking on building a facility, an EV construction project?
Dave, there are many different facets to construction, as many people know. And as friends in the finance world tell me, they hate the construction phase because it's the part they can't control. But it's what I live and breathe every day. And over the last 36 months, I've been fortunate to work on many of these projects that have been taken on here in the U.S. and have learned a lot of lessons through that process. As an owner would look at one of these projects, I think one of the critical considerations is selecting a lead contractor. And someone with experience that could have the reach of the subcontractor community that can actively work one of these projects, because as you highlighted a second ago, many of these projects are multi-billion-dollar projects, which, there was a day not too long ago where multi-billion-dollar projects were pretty much unheard of. Today in this space, every project is $2 to $5 to $7 billion is what we're seeing in the market. So those create unique challenges for the construction industry from a capacity standpoint and from a contractor standpoint. The next critical element would be the contract type. There's different, contracts for different structures, but, there's construction management at risk, with their fees at risk is a common one. Design build, we've seen quite a bit of that, as well as integrated project delivery. All of these have unique characteristics that drive the risk profile, but I would state that, there's some advantages to some over the others. The way these projects are also being built is a multi-phase construction process where you have the core and shell being built and then followed with the equipment phase, which are separate and distinct. And we've run into issues with some sequencing issues related to that, because those may not be interrelated from a management standpoint, but they are interrelated from a risk standpoint. So those have all created unique challenges in the construction process.
Okay. Thank you. And I think it's great insights, because I know you and I've worked together on a lot of these projects. We've seen this firsthand, and your team is amazing. Building from that though, Greg, what do you see as major hurdles facing the design teams when it comes to relation around electrification facilities, lithium-ion battery manufacturing operations?
Well, what we've seen in the market is that it's so new, and that it is so new and growing so fast. There are no true standards for design and protection of the entities that are going on inside the core and shell. Some of the processes are extremely large and have a tremendous amount of volatiles with them. And the hazard is very, very challenging and hasn't been seen before. And with that, you can't just pull a code off the shelf or a data sheet off a shelf and do what the data sheet says or do what the code says. That's the biggest challenge, and it's gaining knowledge of that hazard, this new hazard, and then conveying that information to the stakeholders, to the client, so they know that they've got a hazardous situation that they have to sell. The insurance engineers and the underwriters, they have to be trained and brought up to speed on those things. So I think that's the biggest challenge for a design team is the fast-paced need for construction when you don't have a standard or a code to look to. That's the biggest challenge.
Okay, I understand I might have a little audio issue. I'm going to just go through it. So bear with me. John, building from what you said, has location of EV facilities or plants created challenges related to construction, as well as on the onset of the construction? What are some key considerations?
Yeah, the location has far-reaching implications on the construction process. Number one, the site conditions, depending on where you decide to build, the site conditions are a major factor in insurability and insurability concerns, which we've had no difficulty in placing insurance, but it's a cost differential that you're dealing with when you're dealing with site conditions that may not be ideal. Obviously, the selection of a site from a constructability standpoint is probably not top of mind from an owner's perspective. They're looking at tax incentives and worker availability for the completed project, as well as other considerations. So I'm just speaking from a constructability standpoint. Some of the concerns would be site conditions. It will be subcontractor availability, labor availability in a given market, because some of the markets we've seen haven't had major construction projects. And I mentioned earlier, all these projects are multi-billion-dollar projects, and in some locations, they haven't had multi-billion-dollar construction ever. And trying to make sure that you have the adequate resources, human capital available to build the projects has been a major consideration, because the other option is to bring them in a bus and bring them from other places, which gets very costly from a per diem standpoint to import workers to work on the project, which on some of these, there's no other options because of where they are. But those are some cost considerations that, if I was an owner, I would definitely take into consideration once I resolve some of the permanent issues that you're dealing with relative to the location.
So Greg, with site selection, let's say, being done, what first steps should a company look at taking when proposing that location from a risk engineering perspective?
Well, from a risk engineering standpoint, you would handle it just like you do many other large projects that have challenging hazards within them that need fire protection. And the first thing that all designers should be looking for is water supply. Having a municipality that, or knowing what your water supply is going to be, knowing that if the municipality can't provide you with a robust water supply, you're going to have a pump and tank, or multiple pumps and multiple tanks, depending on the size of your facility. Those are the things that usually, if they are missed on the upfront, it's very, very difficult to add them in after the fact, because the tanks take up a lot of space. Piping needs to be run underground, and there's a lot of things that go on with that from a logistics standpoint, and coordination of trades. I think that that's one of the biggest things. And we've had 2 projects that have come up that are massive projects, and both projects had water supply issues. In particular, one location, like John was saying, some of these locations, these areas are seeing multi-billion-dollar operations where they have never seen a project over 500 million or 250 million. And they're in the middle of these smaller areas that they don't have the infrastructure to handle a large location like that. So from a water supply standpoint, you got to check that out. And then also first responder response, looking at the municipalities' first responders in regard to firefighting and response to fires at the locations. And also these facilities are massive. So having a non just volunteer fire department, those are very difficult challenges to overcome. And have that planted in the back of your mind that you've got a very large campus, and you're relying on a local fire department that may be volunteer only. The consideration for an on-site fire brigade or an on-site fire department is a serious consideration. We've got one extremely large EV battery manufacturer that they are seriously considering, and they're hiring and buying fire trucks right now. That was not in their plan at the very beginning. But now they know that they would overwhelm a local fire department. So.
Yeah, those are great insights. And, my experience in conversations as well, the other things are things like environmental factors, right?
Yeah.
You're not only like your RECRA, toxic release inventories, local municipalities, the fire departments, emergency planning, community right to know act, all of those regulatory standards, water permits, air permits. There are nuances with lithium ion and batteries and manufacturing that are a little bit different than just what I'll call vanilla manufacturing. So it's really important to, get into those municipalities, those local emergency responders, those things, really great. The other piece I'll add in there is those local, you both mentioned that some of the site selection is going to places where maybe the land is cheap, maybe, it's in more rural areas. And what you start to see is, just like with the supply chain issues globally, if you have 4 or 5 contractors or people, and all of a sudden you bring a project like this in, who's going to get supplied first, and who's got the contracts? And it's no different than what we've seen with the semiconductor shortage, rare earth mineral shortages. All of a sudden your supply chain becomes very fragile very quickly, and now you get construction delays, and we all know how that goes. So those are really great insights that you guys have brought up. John, you mentioned the kind of, I think you mentioned in there, the contracts. And I think it's important to understand a little bit more, if you could build on the structure of contracts, what you've seen and what you've actually done with some clients and some organizations, as far as how critical that is, because we know that maybe some of them have been plagued with different issues during the construction phase.
Yeah, Dave, it's a great point that this is one of the most critical elements that we deal with. As discussed earlier, many of these projects are larger than any contracts ever undertaken by many of these firms. And the normal contract owner-contractor relationship is to push as much risk as you can to the contractor, and their balance sheet's equipped to take it. Well, when you're doing a multiple project, as multiple times their size or anything they've done in the past, that's an uneven risk bearance that they're trying to take on. So, I mentioned construction management at risk. That's a normal construction, contract type that's been utilized in the industry for many years. And then in that structure, the contractor, is basically given money for general conditions, everything related to the site, and their fee is on top, and their fee's at risk, and they could lose their fee and then some, because there's a cap. Under design build, similar situation where they hold the design contract, the same structure where they could have massive losses. And in an area like EV that's very, very new, these projects are the core and shell is I wouldn't say it's the most complex, but it includes dry rooms, it includes clean rooms. So there's some intricacies related to the construction that increase the risk profile. And under the normal contracting terms, potentially you're going to end up as an owner with an issue with the contractor potentially going out of business and creating a bigger headache. So the structure that we tend to recommend more is called integrated project delivery. And what that is basically an open book contract, but all of the core contractors they're put their profit at risk, in the deal. And the most they could lose is their profit. They cannot lose any more than that. So again, with the complexity and size of these projects, you're having them put skin in the game, but they're not in jeopardy of potentially going out of business. But in that structure, the owner is taking more risk in that once they max out the cost, including their profit, all the costs come back to the owner. So that's the only negative of it. But again, with the speed and veracity that these projects are hitting the street, it's a viable option. And especially with the learning curve associated with these mega projects, many of the contractors otherwise wouldn't qualify for any type of security. And, that actually filters down to the subcontractors as well.
Yeah, and I think from there, Greg, you talked quite a bit about in our conversations over the last year or two around specifically around fire protection scenarios that entities need to take into consideration when building the battery facilities and/or building out their EV brand, their organization like an OEM or somebody. How can design authority? What's some of the best practices there, and also how do you deal with some of these jurisdictions that have authority? Like you mentioned earlier, there really isn't a code per se. What are some of the best practices around that we've seen?
Well, the best practice that I have seen that has worked is to engage the AHJ as soon as possible and get them to the table with everyone else so they can have an understanding, because most of the AHJs have no idea what this stuff is. And usually if they don't know or have any experience with it, it could be difficult for everybody because they would slow the project down. So we have found that if you can engage that authority having jurisdiction as soon as possible, bring them to the table and ask them, what are your concerns? What is it that you need to know? And dedicate time for them. And as that relationship builds, that eases the project and the turnaround of answers and things like that. They tend to not give pushback or stall projects that they are engaged in. We have seen that on multiple projects where it has worked, has been successful, and then there has been projects where the AHJs weren't involved and it's a nightmare.
Is fire protection, kind of building from that, is fire protection one of the major issues? Like, where batteries are going to be stored, where they're going to be manufactured?
Yeah,
versus,
exactly.
Yeah, so maybe build on that a little.
Yeah, it's not a normal occupancy. There are hazards in there that have been dealt with before. However, when they're all combined together into one, that usually causes AHJs and insurance companies to step back. The manufacturing of batteries, EV batteries, in particular lithium-ion batteries, there are multiple hazards that are in the manufacturing process that will stop any process. You've got flammable liquids, you have powder mixing, you have dust hazard analysis, dust explosion hazards. You have contamination issues. You have ovens that are heat transfer fluid ovens majority of the time. You have heat transfer fluid boilers that are outside, and you also have the oven with the heat transfer fluid systems in them. How are those protected? A lot of folks that are building these operations don't have as much experience as building out these facilities in the United States. There are some issues that we have found that may not have been issues in the countries where they're building these other plants, but when they come to the United States, it does change the field a little bit when it comes to fire protection and where they see protection in the United States as opposed to other locations around the world. But in that sense, fire protection and laying out fire protection and understanding what is going to be needed in these facilities is paramount, because it's a single line, usually a single line process that has different sections to it, from powder mixing to casting to calendaring and notching, and then go into assembly and aging, and then charging and discharging, and then assembly and storage. If anything happens to any of those parts of that chain, your process is stopped. So having your protection in place to give yourself some resiliency, give yourself some robust ability to keep things moving and just mitigate downtime. Because like John was saying, it's a clean operation. It's all humidity controlled. It's all conditioned space. So any hiccup is going to stall you, and they don't have time to stall.
Yeah, we're in the age of acceleration.
It's beyond speed. And the thing is there's some situations that are pitfalls that you find that when you have other entities building these operations and they don't have the fire protection, either expertise or the knowledge of the AHJs that are driving fire protection, or insurance companies that are driving fire protection and protecting your risks. You come in after the fact. We had a project where we came in after the fact and we brought in insurers through prospects, and they were asking where the sprinklers were. And we were asking where the sprinklers were. And they said, well, we don't sprinkler these where we build them. Well, yeah, well, you have to sprinkler them now. Oh, well, it's already designed. It's already put in. We've got all these things already built, and they've been manufactured and brought over and they've been installed. We don't have any room for sprinklers. Well, we had to come up with a retrofit sprinkler design that was a robust design that they were not anticipating. So those are some of the other things that we run into.
What do they call those? Change orders, John?
Oh, it was a multi-million-dollar change order. It was unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a nice segue over to another question for John, which is, the unique challenges around this technology. I mean, Greg just talked about all the different types of technology that are going into these lithium ion factories, and either a standalone battery manufacturer or within an existing retrofitted OEM facility that maybe they're doing their own battery. What considerations from the construction side, that new technology that you've seen, John?
It's created quite a few challenges, to say the least. As we've experienced, a lot of the technology is coming from Korea and China, and obviously everyone is in the arms race to get ahead, but they're very secretive about their technology until the plants are up and running. So we're running into issues with basic information not wanting to be supplied, and trying to get insurers to guarantee products and product delivery without adequate information, as you know, is a big challenge for our industry. So negotiating some of those issues have been tantamount to success. But I won't say it's easy. It's been tough, and obviously some of this is not tested and not true. It's more prototypical, which underwriters hate to hear that word, but we try to dissuade them and tell them it's not prototypical, but in some cases it is a little prototypical, which creates some unique challenges related to that, and trying to get insurers to sign on. And again, we haven't had difficulty in getting insurance. We've had more difficulty in managing, pricing and cost has been the primary driver in dealing with some of these issues. But dry rooms and clean rooms are not unique. The data centers have them and other places have them. But in these types of facilities where, again, as I mentioned earlier, you have sequencing issues where, the construction is bifurcated between equipment install and core and shell. And oftentimes one's happening above or below the other, creates some very, very unique challenges relating to, what could transpire from a loss standpoint, and trying to develop PMLs based on that has been one of our biggest challenges.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I think it's funny, the question just came in, so I'm going to ask this question. Either one of you can weigh in. I think this might go to Greg more, but question regarding the regulatory requirement that you mentioned, Greg, that there's really kind of not something set in stone about this with the AHJs. Is there an assessment approach that you've seen that works a little better than others as far as looking at the diagnostics for storage, fire setup, suppression systems, sprinkler systems, anything like that? Is there any kind of assessment that you found that's been, kind of across the board, accretive to efficiency, I guess is what I'm saying, and meeting the intent of the local standards as well?
Well, that's a great question. And that's a daily thing. When there is no regulatory things that are going on, it's bringing the authorities having jurisdiction in and talking to them about it. Like, this is what we have. This is what can happen if you don't do this. If this, going through a what if analysis or a process hazard analysis with those particular folks to get them to understand where the things are coming from, and then lay down the protection scenarios that you have found in the past that have worked well for those particular scenarios. We're finding that with electric vehicle batteries and the batteries at the OEMs and also at the manufacturers, that water is the story. Providing water to a thermal event, a warming event, is key. Getting it there as fast as possible. And there are systems out there that we have looked at that will provide that water. It's basically an NRAC system with a scheme A or a scheme 8-9A that is a tremendous amount of water on your product. And we have found that if you have an event in your EV battery, you're not putting the battery of origin out. It ain't going out. You're mitigating the thermal radiative heat flux from that origin to the other elements and the other exposures in that space. So you are keeping that battery cool and all the other batteries around it cool as best you can. That's really the only thing that we have found as being something that'll work but there's no regulation on it. But it's just discussing those particular things with those AHJs, with those engineers, the carrier engineers and their underwriters, to get them to understand this is how things are going. We have found that it seems as though we are limiting the amount of storage in these facilities to mitigate loss. In these large formation rooms, in these EV battery manufacturing facilities, you really can't, not store it over 10 feet or anything like that. We've got some that have racking that's over 90 feet tall, that and 130 feet deep by 90 feet wide. Massive formation rooms where they charge and discharge these large batteries. And the exposure is tremendous because you're taking these batteries up to 100% and then down, and then back up to 100% and down. You're training the battery in its life cycle, exercising it. And that's when you can send one south. One can go off on you, and it's all in how you're protecting your exposures in those circumstances. Yeah.
Well, and a question came in again on if FM or NFPA have any promulgated rules, or is there anything that they've got out there that you're aware of?
NFPA, and that's one of the things that we've seen as we go through and talk with these AHJs. They're referring to standards that exist. And a lot of times the AHJ will start quoting an energy storage system requirement or code section that the ESS systems have been around longer than the EV battery plants and EV manufacturers that use the EV batteries. So they have designed, and they've had a lot of losses to learn from. Those energy storage systems, it seems like back maybe a year or two ago, every other day one was catching on fire, or the cabinets or the building that they were in were blowing apart in an explosion. So those, losses drive standards. One of the things that we haven't talked about yet is what's needed in the industry right now, and it's testing. It's testing on EV batteries. It's EV the cells, because there's all different types of cells. There's all configurations. There's all different types of chemistries. There's all different types of electrolyte, quantities of electrolyte, materials of the construction of the modules, and then also into the packs. We need data in order to drive protection scenarios for either spacing or height or how to deliver density on sprinkler systems. That's what's needed. Right now, we're drowning them with huge sprinkler systems because we don't know. We don't know. So we are being ultra conservative when it comes to those things.
And John, the thought comes to mind regarding, are there any considerations around specific building materials, like specialty products, and how does that limit the contractors that you can actually go out and find? Because like you mentioned earlier, not every contractor is built to build a facility like this. So it just brings that kind of idea up front, like are there specialty materials, contract information, things like that, building from that question from one of our attendees.
So obviously with the advent of CLT, cross-laminated timber, and other specialty products, my caution would be, the insurers have been burned on those products and pretty much frown upon using them in facilities like this, as Greg's been highlighting, because of some of the issues related to not having, the regulations in place and really having the data to support what would happen in those scenarios. Just in basic construction configuration, CLT has shown issues, flammability issues and other issues that would not be conducive to this type of arrangement. So fortunately, on most of our projects so far, we have not had to deal with that. It has been discussed, and we have dissuaded clients from going down that road because of those concerns. Stick to concrete, stick to masonry, things that are less flammable until some of the data can be harvested to support some of the more futuristic construction techniques. So for the most part, everyone's staying away from it. I definitely stand behind that idea that you don't want to venture into newer technologies because they may be cheaper, but they may cost you more in the long term because of some of these concerns and some of the flammability issues that could arise from it.
I wanted to add in on that. As we know, most of these installers and designers are either China or South Korea. And we ran into a situation where the contractors that were fitting out these clean rooms, these dust control zones, were using panels that were imported from Korea. And we had no testing, no data sheet. There's no ASTM testing data. There's no UL testing. There's no FM testing on these panels. Even the translation came back and it said it hasn't been tested. And they introduced it into the building. Now that is always, when everyone walks in that building, they want to know what those panels are, and we've got to tell them we have to get them tested. So we're in the process of getting 4x4 panels of that particular foreign panel to get tested because no one knows what it is.
Yeah, and the other thing that comes to mind in this is John mentioned CLT. These facilities, you think the output, right, is a product that helps other organizations achieve aspirations around ESG. And so now you have those aspirations of the construction company and the owner operator or whatever. trying to also achieve things. And, you know, Greg, you're talking about massive amounts of water being used. Isn't that so much directly and, you know,
it's only used when it's on fire.
Right. But these are the type of things that
Absolutely.
people look at and say, hey, you need a standard because we can't just, you know, we just can't arbitrarily flood entire storage zones just because we don't have a standard. We've got the environment to consider, right? We've got natural biodiversity. We've got all these other issues. So, you know, it's a bit of, Greg, you mentioned this the other day when we were talking about, it's a bit of an, you know, kind of an oxymoron. Like, hey, all of this is really great, but like, are we not contradicting ourselves a little bit here too? And those are considerations that many people have come to us. I know you guys, we've all talked about this. Organizations have come to us and said some of that is a concern, and how do you address that? And it is something that you need to think about up front, and how to address, you know, alternative materials, trying to achieve maybe net zero or, you know, reducing carbon footprint. But then on the same side, we need to build a facility that can actually produce the product and be sustainable and build, you know, and so there's got to be a balancing act.
It is definitely a dichotomy. And one of the things that we're finding is that with all the sustainability goals and zero net carbon and all of that stuff, we're seeing the clients wanting to do more renewable energy sources, photovoltaic cells on roofs, wind turbines, things like that. Those are the things, in particular, if it's a roof mounted PV array, you got to know about that before you start designing that building, because the roof and its design is ultra important when it comes to your flammability, your combustibility rating, flame spread rating, what type of panels you're using, how they're being adhered, what's the wind uplift, how is it affecting the roof's profile, all of that stuff. Because a lot of these designers think, oh yeah, we're just going to do PV on the roof. We're going to do the whole roof PV. Whoa, you're going to get that insured? Well, let's take a look at how you're putting that on there. And I hope you're doing it the right way. And this is how you're supposed to do it, kind of thing. So we got to keep our eyes on that as well, because they're being charged with putting forth sustainable things. They're going to do vehicles that don't run on gasoline. They're going to want to start supplementing their energy supply with wind turbines and with photovoltaic cells.
Yeah, John, I know construction delays are, you know, the worst thing that could happen. And I'm thinking about what Greg's saying there. You know, is that something up front that you talk to people like, hey, if you have aspirations of, you know, having, you know, this or this or this, they're all going to be dependent on each other, right? I mean, is that not a consideration?
Absolutely. And you know, the good news is we've been involved in projects, most of these projects from beginning to end, and had those interactions with the design team to make sure that we're overlaying the concerns from an insurability standpoint as well as a constructability standpoint to make sure, A, you know, it'll work. Number two, we can get it insured, as Greg indicated, because a big problem is, again, this is all new. The speed in which these projects are hitting the street is unprecedented, and the size of them and the challenges it's putting on and the pressure it's putting on the industry overall from a capacity standpoint is huge. And you know, designers are not immune from that, because again, not many of these have been designed. So trying to, you know, infiltrate new technologies, trying to address ESG is a critical concern. And I think that will get better over time, obviously, as the learning curve it becomes less steep. But right now there's a huge learning curve, and you know, like I said earlier, everyone's in an arms race to get projects built as soon as possible to not fall behind their competitors. So that's putting a little bit more pressure on. So I think, you know, my projection is in the early stages, I think there'll be, you know, less sustainable products used, but over time that will increase as we learn more about and some of the standards get set. And, you know, as Greg mentioned, which will help alignment along those projects, because right now you just can't introduce, like I said, anything that's not tried and true and not flammable into these with these lithium batteries, because, you know, you're just asking for a problem, and insurability is going to be one of them.
Yeah. Speaking of insurability, you know, Greg, let me go to one of our kind of getting close to, we'll go some Q&A here and open lines. Hopefully people can continue. I'll remind everybody, please use the Q&A for any questions. But Greg, insurance, a lot of people always ask when we talk about new and emerging risks, right? These seismic shifts that we're addressing here and what we've talked about today, many of our clients and others in the industry always ask, what carriers, right? What markets have an appetite for this? Not only, John, I'll ask your opinion here shortly, but, Greg, from a risk engineering perspective, someone asked earlier about FM or NFPA, FM obviously, but other carriers, or is it specialty markets, or what's out there? What have we seen, and what have we actually done to solve for this, and what markets maybe have we seen?
Well, the projects are so, and the locations are so large. There's not many, only one that I know of that would be able to write the entire thing, and that would be Factory Mutual. But Factory Mutual is an engineering underwriting company. They are going to want to know exactly what's going on in that building. We have interaction with them on many EV plants they may be prospecting, but they are taking their time on those things. They want to know exactly, because they're all about testing. They will only let you do what they know works. And if you don't know if you can't handle that heat release rate on that particular commodity, they want to have a minimal amount of storage with a maximum amount of fire protection. But from the standpoint of outside of them, it's usually been a shared and layered or a quota share or something like that, with multiple carriers from all over the place. And they're just splitting it up and diversifying their risk and splitting their risk up because they don't know what it is. We've got one operation, I think there's like 50 carriers on the panel. It's insane. I've never seen anything. It looked like a checkerboard for the layout. So to answer that question, no one has stepped up to be the EV or EV battery manufacturing or EV plant go-to market. No one has. But it takes time. This is a new thing. This is a brand new thing. And if you don't do it right, you're paying for it. You're going to lose that building.
Greg, just to carry that a little bit, what risk engineering is usually requested? I know we have a wish list, right? Like we know give us a sense of the things that are the must-haves for those. Because I know that right. John mentioned it earlier, and John can talk about that as well when I asked John the same question about, data is king. So right. Like what from risk engineering perspective? Early
and often early intervention and in constant communication on projects. Get them involved, get the insurers involved early on projects, even if it's just if you're just doing a concept design. Get them into the meeting and have them ask their questions so they feel comfortable, because they have to go back to their underwriters saying, hey, do you like this? You don't like this? And have a trusted advisor in the room with the client and the insurer to help them along, to help them understand where these things are coming from, and that they keep an open mind. Because that's really the only way that this whole thing is going to move forward, is if everything maintains insurability and people are gaining that knowledge and learning from it.
Okay. John, you mentioned the integrated programs, right? Like this was critical. Same question for you. Markets, the benefit of how we design the programs, but then also, what are the must-haves, from a data perspective, that are going to help people achieve their goals and stay on track in those things.
Well, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. It's all about, getting as much data as you can. Fortunately, in the construction space, with as large as we are, we haven't had an issue getting these projects insured from a construction standpoint. But the carriers are all different depending on the line. On professional liability, which is a big driver, especially in newer technology. AXA XL, Berkeley, have been our lead players, along with Berkshire Hathaway and Zurich. So, we've been oversubscribed on every project so far, because we basically give them as much data as they want, and probably more than they want, to make sure they understand exactly what we're doing from a brokering standpoint. But they have all the constructability documents and access to the team. We have weekly phone calls with most of our clients on these projects to make sure we don't miss anything. because we have to dovetail all the coverages to make sure there are no gaps. Then you have the builder's risk side. And as Greg mentioned, that makes everyone a little bit nervous. So most of those have been quota shares. Most of ours have been led by Zurich, but Liberty Mutual, Star, and others are willing to participate on those programs, but no one's usually willing to take more than 20 to 25% of the line on those projects because of the newness of it and the concern about, there are no standards, and, they can apply their normal construction standards, but, whether that will, hold water, no pun intended, related to these types of projects, we don't know yet.
Right.
And that's a big struggle in trying to, get them comfortable with it. And as Greg mentioned earlier, the whole idea of what's the storage capacity, because, most of these projects we built, they're building multiple lines. They're building anywhere from 5 to 15 lines to produce batteries, as an example. And those lines come online at different points in time. And, our structure has been, we're going to ensure the entire project until the final line under the builder's risk is built, so that therefore, if anything happens along the way, you don't have some that phased off and others that are in, because then you have insurance companies doing the finger pointing at each other, figuring out who caused the issue. So our structure has been, let's make sure we insure it until it's turned over to the owner. All lines complete, all lines have been tested. There's no issues, and now you go to permanent insurance. So that's been one of our critical components. And from the casualty standpoint, the same thing is carriers have been very, very supportive of us. We're buying, obviously, with the size of these projects, we're buying a lot of limit, up to $200-300 million of limit for these projects, to make sure that if there is an issue, we have adequate insurance to cover it. Again, Zurich and Excel has been leading a lot of those efforts for us, and we've had much more capacity than we've needed to get them built, because we've over communicated with them to make sure that every I's dotted and every T's crossed along the way.
Yeah. Interesting quick question. We've seen, the headlines slide showed a lot of JVs. I mean, kind of a loaded question, but when you get these JVs and it's like, okay, who's going to carry what risk and where? I know that might be a question that other people on the line have, and some of them might actually be JVs with each other right now. So interesting. Have we run into anything, a unique risk, or how have had to solve for that?
Absolutely. I'll take the first crack at it. It's definitely a challenge during the construction phase, because you have different risk appetites. You have different philosophies that have to be applied. Some like large deductibles, some don't like large deductibles, et cetera. So all of those have to be, you have to manage that communication through the process. And you're also trying to balance costs, because everyone has a budget. So those joint ventures are creating, or have created, some issues. The bifurcation in the construction between core and shell and equipment has helped a little bit, but it's also hurt, because now you have the sequencing issue as to who's doing what, when, and where, and no one is quarterbacking the entire process, which leads to other concerns about, is the right connections in the building? The core and shell contractor didn't anticipate other things that need to be considered for the equipment phase. So, that bifurcation is good in one way, but it's also bad in managing risk, because you don't know, obviously, what you don't know. And a lot of times we're finding out after the fact, oh, we should have done this, 3 steps back, as Greg mentioned, and where you're starting to have retrofits and other things.
Yeah. Greg, you mentioned kind of on the JV, but maybe just the influence of foreign entities coming. And like you mentioned, something about products being used. Mm-hmm. Any hiccups or issues along, hey, fire suppression, US regulations.
Yes.
That kind of thing. Maybe just touch on that a little bit, how to solve for that.
Yeah, that's where it comes out. There are some situations where the designs come from South Korea or China, and they're given to the entity in the States, and they're just handed the project. Here it is. It's designed, do this, but it hasn't been reviewed by, or there hasn't been a third-party review that has put a lens over it that is related to the U.S. codes and standards, or insurance standards in the United States. We have seen multiple projects that have been hit with retrofits because of that same situation. So even with early and often communication, you can still get these situations because of that design coming from another part of the world. And that's something that you just have to know about it. The general contractor has to be well-versed in handling JVs with, like John was saying, the core and shell are going to be the nuts and bolts guys and the tin knockers. And then you've got the folks that are coming in to install these pieces of equipment that are highly specific pieces of equipment and extremely precise, extremely precise. So, and from, I don't know if John mentioned it, but from a builder's risk standpoint, when that machinery and equipment arrives from Korea or China, it's in these giant boxes with, desiccant pouches in them and making sure that there's no moisture buildup in them. But that piece of equipment took 8 months to build,
Right.
and it's huge. And putting that in the building, man, that's a nerve-wracking thing to watch.
Yeah, I used to work at a tier 1 supplier that was an injection molder that made bumpers, and the molds themselves were 40 tons, and moving those around was not easy. And coming all the way from Germany took weeks.
Right.
I could only imagine,
Don't drop it.
This type of, don't drop the mold, but this type of technology, no different, especially with the supply chain issues. I mean, I don't mean to sound, kind of cliche-ish, but the reality is logistics and supply chain, these are serious considerations. If John mentioned it, you both mentioned it, we are beyond light speed in this race for mobility and race for electrification, and any type of delay could really be a difference. And you raise a really good point. I know we're getting close to time here. I just mention again, if anybody wants to get into the Q&A, please drop in a question for us. We'd love to answer it. But one of the themes that I think comes through with this, and we want people to go away from especially, is, this whole concept to construction to commercialization. And, those are big, lofty towers, and in each area, each one is connected. And today, we really wanted to focus on the whole idea of construction leading towards the property and the construction and the insurance, the contracts. These are the things. The companies that are doing this, right? All the names that out there have aspirations to be doing autonomous technology, mobility, subscription services, doing the right thing for the environment, and they're thinking 10 years ahead. The reality is, to even get a vehicle on the road, all of what we talked about today has to happen. Just like workers' compensation too. You've got to hire a workforce. You've got to bring thousands of people in, and you've got to train them, and you've got to do this. But if you don't have a building and you don't have the technology inside the building to build the products, it doesn't happen. And so that's one of the things we just wanted to highlight today for everybody on the line, was we recognize that risk is throughout all of it, but also there's tremendous opportunity for all of this if it's done correctly and it's thoughtfully done. And as hopefully everybody today heard from John and from Greg, just how intricate this can get. It's possible, obviously. We've solved for it. We continue to do that, but it's got to be done in a very thoughtful way and methodically to ensure that the product and that aspiration, the vision of organizations can be realized. So I don't see any other questions. We'll do the Bueller going once, going twice. If at any point in time a question pops up and we catch it before we stop the recording, we'll be sure to answer it. We will have a recording. We will send out a recording of this to everybody who registered. I would like to personally thank John and Greg for their time and their expertise in this area. We've been working together for literally almost 2 years, different construction projects, different opportunities, and we've been learning and we'll continue to learn. And obviously, this is a tremendous opportunity within the U.S. and globally, and we do not see this going away, obviously. So, a lot of risk, but with risk comes opportunity as well. So we're really excited about the topic. And again, thanking everybody for joining us today. I don't see any others. So with that, again, thanks for your time today, for all the attendees. Hopefully you got something out of this. And until next time, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.